Well, forgive me, friends, Romans, countrymen. Lend me your ears as we kick off this final event in our Comedies, Histories and Tragedies panel series. We had to do that. Presented by the State Library of New South Wales in partnership with Bell Shakespeare. Whether you're joining us here tonight, thank you so much, as well as the people who are watching this recording online later. Welcome all. My name is Joanna Erskine. I'm the Head of Education at Bell Shakespeare and I will be the host for this evening. Before we start, I also want to take this moment to thank the State Library team. They're wonderful to work with, particularly thanks to Lydia Tasker and Callum McLean for all their work organising and building these events. And the audience turnout for this series has been extraordinary. They've pretty much all been sold out and it's just been a joy to be part of it, so thank you. In this series, we've looked at Shakespeare's writing of romance, tragedy, bloody battles and magic, and tonight we're here to discuss his political thriller, Julius Caesar. It is, of course, part of the celebrations for the 400th anniversary of Shakespeare's first folio, and the library's exhibition For All Time, Shakespeare in Print, which closes this week. Now, the first folio was compiled by Shakespeare's friends 7 years after his death, and if they hadn't done that, we would have lost, and may have lost, a remarkable 18, pretty much half the catalogue of his plays, including such classics as You Like It, The Tempest, The Scottish Play, and most importantly for our conversation tonight, Julius Caesar. Now, Julius Caesar is a perennial favourite with audiences, owing in large part to its powerful use of language. And Shakespeare wrote the play in the style of the great orators of ancient Rome. And as an exploration of power and politics, the play is arguably unparalleled. The literal backstabbing at the heart of the play serves as a compelling metaphor for modern politics, I'm sure you'd all agree. And in film and theatre, artists around the world have used Julius Caesar as a platform to explore power and tyranny. So let's meet our panel. We have Associate Professor Hugh Griffiths from the University of Sydney. My colleague, Associate Director of Bell Shakespeare, James Evans. Actor and speech pathologist, Marianne Fonseca. And writer, performer and broadcaster, Chris Taylor. Okay, now our panel has a range of experience with the play. Chris, you created a show called Dead Caesar, which premiered at Sydney Theatre Company. James, you directed Bell Shakespeare's 2018 national touring production of the play, which Marianne, you performed in. So we're going to speak to the play and its history and significance, representations of the play and personal experiences with Julius Caesar. But let's start with where the impetus for Shakespeare's writing began. So, Hugh Griffiths. We always like to start these panels by talking about where Shakespeare got the idea for the play. It's pretty clear with this one from the pages of history. So would Shakespeare's audience be familiar with the story of Julius Caesar, and what would have been the impetus for Shakespeare to write about such a famous piece of history?
They'd been very familiar with the story. Shakespeare himself steals the story almost wholesale from Plutarch, and particularly from a popular translation of Plutarch by North, a kind of widely published, well-read translation of the history of famous Romans. So it's a really well-known story, and it's a good peg for him to kind of hang all sorts of current concerns on. So I think the impetus comes from the popularity of the story, the obviously kind of compelling nature of the story, a political murder, who doesn't like that, but also that it gives him the opportunity to discuss in public, in potentially a slightly veiled form, key issues that would have been important to Elizabethans. Somebody who's getting too ambitious, looks like he wants to be a king, somehow matching some of the turbulent politics of the later years of Elizabeth's reign. So 1599 is a kind of really turbulent year. It's an important year for Shakespeare. He's getting very experimental. It's the year he also writes Hamlet, As You Like It, and Henry V. So it's quite a big year for Shakespeare, a kind of breakout year in some ways. It's also just on the verge of the Globe being built. So he's really establishing a big public presence in London as an important writer. After a period of writing a number of romantic comedies and all the English history plays, he's moving into a kind of much broader sphere somehow, and Julius Caesar is one opportunity to do that. Why is it topical? Well, at the end of Elizabeth's reign, there are all sorts of kind of moves happening around her. There's a lot of concern that she's not leaving behind an heir, or she's not naming an heir. There's a concern that she's becoming increasingly tyrannical, and that might be partly echoed in the Caesar story. There's also kind of in the 1590s leading up to it, a series of riots in London as well. So those popular riots are echoed like in the opening scene, but also in the scenes around the speeches at Caesar's funeral. So that concern with where does power lie? Does it lie with the people, with a potential king, or with politicians? That question that motors the whole play is really important to Shakespeare and his audience right at this moment, at a moment where Elizabeth is really grabbing hold of power for all she's worth, but where it looks like it might slip away. Where earlier in her career she had ruled with a kind of, what's often called by historians a kind of fake republic, a kind of monarchical republic, like in concert with Parliament, with a Privy Council, taking lots of advice. By the end of the 16th century, lots of people have tried to assassinate her. She's gotten fed up with taking lots of advice, and she's really grabbing onto power in a much more dictatorial way, in a more violent way, killing more of her opponents if she can. And this play really speaks to all of those issues really pointedly. The other thing that happens, sorry about that. The other thing that happens in 1599 is something called a bishop's ban, which bans people from discussing English history. Now, Shakespeare's been getting away with this on the stage for years up until this point, but you're not at this point allowed to do it in print. And he doesn't do any more English history plays from this moment on.
Yeah, that's right. Was it the last history play?
So Henry V is the last proper English history play. No more from this point on. Well, he writes Henry VIII later, but it's a much later and a very different kind of thing. But he does write another Roman play after this, Antony and Cleopatra. So his interest in politics, in the situation, like where power is situated, that gets kind of shifted slightly into these Roman plays from this moment on.
Can I just ask you, do we know if Shakespeare was a monarchist? Because it seems one of the real tensions of the play, and certainly I guess Brutus's conundrum is that between kingship, monarchy versus a republic. And in a way, it's obviously, I think Caesar is frequently sort of assumed to be a warning call about the dangers of ambition and tyranny and all of that. But it's also not a great ad for civil war, which sort of follows the death of Caesar. And I always wondered if Shakespeare was sort of writing the play where the last two acts are almost of the warning to the Elizabethan people, to going, sure, Elizabeth's getting a bit uppity, but do we want the alternative? Do we know if he was, what side of that debate was he on?
It's almost impossible not to be a monarchist in the 1590s. It's very difficult for English people to imagine themselves out of the monarchy, but what kind of monarchy they have, that really is up for discussion. And I think we often don't realise quite how mixed and various the political discussions during Elizabeth's reign were. We assume that she's a kind of hangover from medieval monarchy, maybe a prelude to much more centralised monarchy under her successors, James and Charles, who notably does get replaced by a republic. But actually, there's lots of ideas flying around. Another big important book that gets published in 1599 is by Louis Lucanor. It's a description in English of the Venetian Republic, and it was weirdly popular. It was way more popular than Julius Caesar in London at the time. It was published many times, read by politicians, written by a politician, and it's a glowing description of how wonderful the Venetian Republic is. And you wouldn't think you would get away with these ideas in Elizabethan England, but you do if they're discussed in a certain way. So I think it's hard to say that he's not a monarchist, but I think he sees the dangers of centralized power. All his kind of centralizing monarchs, Richard III and to some extent Henry V, are monstrous criminals. And so it's kind of difficult to see him supporting that kind of monarchy. And in fact, for most of his life, he's lived under a monarch, Elizabeth, who was not like that. But she is becoming like that. And her successors certainly were a bit more like that. So it's the kind of monarchy you live with that I think that's under dispute. That said, republicanism did get a bit of a hearing sometimes as well, and it does a little bit in this play. Yeah.
And yes, of course, we know we've been talking a lot in this series about how good Shakespeare is at commenting on his own society while setting a play in another place and time. So really interesting. Now, Hugh, you just mentioned this. Julius Caesar was written, it was one of the plays that Shakespeare wrote in an extraordinary burst of creativity in 1599, in and around 1599. And it's believed at this time he wrote Much Ado About Nothing, Henry V, As You Like It, Julius Caesar, and an early draft of Hamlet. Now, James, these plays are all very different in tone and content, aren't they? So what does it tell us about Shakespeare's writing that he could produce a play like Julius Caesar alongside these other works?
Well, I mean, I guess no one else has been able to do that since. I mean, when you're an author, either you're really good at comedy or you're really good at tragedy, or you're right about the history. But it seems like Shakespeare just tried his hand at everything. He said, "Oh, I've done history now. Now I'm going to move on to comedy and tragedy, and let's look at what those say about our society." It seems like he kept wanting to challenge himself, especially this play is so unlike any others that he wrote before, trying to write like a Roman, really, and all of that all of those rhetorical devices that come in. And really, it's the play that is most about language for me, how words and language can change us, the way that people's speech actually has a powerful impact on large groups of people. And also he starts to criticise, of course, which he's done before in his in the Henry VI plays, the mob. And he starts to look at the way that people moving in kind of mass formations can really be swayed and change. And, I mean, that is such a contemporary idea. You can see the way that it unfolded in American politics over the last few years and will continue to do so, I imagine. 1599, what an amazing year. And I think a lot of it has to do with that, the shift to the Globe Theatre, and what a cracking good story that is. The whole, I'm not sure if you guys know the story of they used to have a theatre called The Theatre. And the landlord said, I want to turn it into a shopping centre or something, I don't know. So you guys are out. And Shakespeare and his friend said, well, that's fine, but we own the building. The landlord said, like hell you do, I own the building. Then the landlord went off somewhere for his holidays. Shakespeare and his mates turn up with a bunch of carpenters and tools, meet a little bit of resistance from the landlord's friends, quickly overcome that, tear the building down, plank by plank, put it in storage over the winter, and the landlord comes back to an empty plot of land. Apparently there's a lawsuit, as there always was in Elizabethan England. There's a very litigious time. Shakespeare and his company win the lawsuit. They've got the building, and they literally reconstruct it on the south bank of the Thames with the Globe Theatre. So it seems like Shakespeare's really thinking about building a theatre from the ground up, and there's something about that really inspires him into all sorts of different directions.
And keeping the audience happy with all these different genres and types of plays, hey? Okay, now let's all think back to our first experiences of Julius Caesar, maybe when you were very young. And Chris, I believe Julius Caesar was the first Shakespeare that you studied as a student. What was the experience like? Do you remember?
Deeply unrewarding. It was the first Shakespeare play I formally studied. I would have seen maybe film adaptations, but it was the first one we sat down and went through line by line, and it was unrewarding because the person, it was year 9, and I went to this school where you paid a lot of money to learn how to row and speak Latin, but they weren't very good at teaching Shakespeare. In fact, the English teacher we had teaching Julius Caesar was the rugby coach, and I'm not making this up. And he would always be 20 minutes late to class because he had the more important task of putting that week's team together and sort of organising who's injured and who's not. So he'd always stagger in, literally in jocks, and like he dressed as a PE teacher and sat down. And the only way he could really, he was like 82, he was really old and old school. And the only way he could really bring it to our attention and make sense of it for himself was to always use rugby metaphors to describe, which is completely wrong for Julius Caesar. So the assassination scene was described as a scrum and all of this. So it wasn't a great first introduction, and it certainly didn't give me any appetite. I've always struggled to study Shakespeare, actually. I think it's only through seeing productions, I think, that it's really come alive for me. I don't know how others have felt, but I never had that, like, Dead Poets Society teacher moment where someone brought it alive for me. It was actors who brought it alive for me. The teachers I had were hopeless.
Yeah, and I think that's the story for many actors, is they also didn't have a great time with Shakespeare in school, but, you know, when they saw it performed, things changed. Was that the same for you, or did you study Julius Caesar as a student?
Yeah, so similar to Chris, my first experiences would have been the 3-hour-long movies, you know, years and years ago.
BBC productions.
Yeah, and like I think I would have watched it with my dad or someone far too young to kind of, you know, piece together what everything was meaning. Like it was big concepts. I don't think we studied it extensively in my high school years, but, you know, came across the monologues and a lot of the audition monologues that people use in drama school. But it was actually my second year of drama school, so when I was studying at NIDA, and James actually came in for a 2-week intensive that we had at the start of the year. And we were given scenes, so we brought in monologues that we wanted to work on, and then we were actually given scenes to work on, a bit of a masterclass kind of process. And that was, to be completely honest, that was where I was really able to unpack the meaning behind the relationships with the scene I was given was Portia and Brutus, and to be able to dig my teeth into it and sink my teeth into it in a way where, you know, I was supported by one of the most incredible minds from Bell Shakespeare and in Shakespeare. So that was really valuable for me. And then after that, I had the opportunity to be touring around in the role of Portia as well. So, you know, working with a team and unpacking it, and in the context of the modern world and how it related to politics.
And we're going to talk about that soon, because that was the 2018 national touring production that Bell Shakespeare does that goes to, 27 venues around the country. So really interesting to hear about that experience, which we'll get to. But first, Chris, I want to hear about your show, Dead Caesar, which was presented at Sydney Theatre Company in 2007. Now, out of all of Shakespeare's plays, why choose Julius Caesar to adapt? Maybe due to your high school experience there. And secondly, how do you make a play about politics and murder funny?
Oh, the second bit's easy. Well, not... okay, I don't know if anyone saw it. I assume
Tell us about
no one did. It was very broad. It was more like the Wharf Review, but like a sort of a 90-minute vaudeville musical comedy about sort of ostensibly spoofing the Julius Caesar's play, but really using it as a platform, and I'm sure you already alluded to this, to comment, like Shakespeare himself seemed to be doing, to comment on modern political crises at the time. The reason I did it, it was sort of twofold. I've always loved period comedy, like, you know, I grew up on Python and Blackadder, so anything with togas or... so The Life of Brian was just the greatest thing ever to me. And there was sort of a proud tradition of toga-based comedy or ancient Rome-based comedy. Stephen Sondheim's musical A Funny Thing Happened on the way to the Forum. The thing that I really just was incredibly influential on me, I don't know if anyone knows it, but my parents didn't have many comedy records in their collection, but they had one. It was a Wayne and Schuster called "Rinse the Blood Off My Toga." Does anyone know this? It was the most wonderful. It was like a parody of Raymond Chandler, Private Dick, sort of investigating the murder of Caesar. And I always it was just so quotable, and I remember that. So when I was offered the chance to write something for the STC, I think they'd hoped I was going to write something quite serious and meaningful and dramatic. But I still had, it was at the peak of Chaser period. We were doing The War on Everything, and I had a lot of silliness still in me. And I said, I want to do a silly Blackadder Python type comedy, but I want it to be an allegory for political things that are on my mind. And it's interesting because when most people sort of use Caesar as a metaphor for something that's going on in contemporary politics, they normally go to like a leader that's getting a bit big for his boots or assuming too much power. So today, Trump, Putin, Boris Johnson a couple of years ago, they would have been natural allegories. And I didn't want to do that. The thing that was going on, it was 2007, I think, was the Iraq War. And so I used the template of the plot that we all know of Julius Caesar to actually comment on the overthrow of Saddam Hussein. So rather than use our Western leaders as the Caesar character, I used them as the Brutus in character. They weren't obviously Blair and Bush, but you didn't need to dig too far to realise I was sending up the coalition of the Willings false evidence for overthrowing a dictator. And I thought it was, the worry when you do these sorts of allegories and political satires is that they're too heavy-handed and they're too obvious. And even though I threw in so many references to all the buzzwords of that period, like regime change and mission accomplished, I don't think I ever met anyone who saw Dead Caesar who understood it was an allegory for the Iraq War. I think, so maybe I was too subtle about it, because it's always the challenge for a writer of these things is you don't want to over-egg it and be accused of being too obvious. Maybe I went too far the other way. But yeah, it was my response to what was going on about the overthrow of a dictator, but a dictator who wasn't one of ours. It wasn't like, remember Alan Moyer in the Herald? He always did Howard as Caesar. He did Little Caesar. And it was, I always thought that was a bit done and a bit easy. And I thought it was kind of an interesting way into using Julius Caesar satirically by treating the Cassius and Brutus figures, not the Caesar figure, as our contemporary leaders. And so that's a long-winded answer about how I came to write that. Yeah.
Yeah, and comedy's the way in, and musical as well.
Look, I think so. That's always been worked for me. There's so many ways into any dark material. I've mostly used comedy as my tool and spent a lifetime trying to justify it and apologise for it. But I strongly believe that dark material can be made more accessible and more palatable through comedy. The one thing that came out of that show that you might know was the Eulogy Song, which was a song that we did end up doing on The Chaser, and it became slightly scandalous. The Prime Minister literally gave a press conference to denounce this eulogy song, which the refrain was even pricks turn into top blokes after death. And that was Mark Antony's eulogy at Caesar's funeral in the play. And it was just an opportunity to give a eulogy in the play and comment on something that I'd been thinking about. But yeah, that was the sort of the cut through song from the piece.
So, all right, let's move on to language then, because, and I want to talk to you, Marianne, because you've got a really interesting background in not just as an actor, but as a speech pathologist. Julius Caesar is, of course, known as a political play, but at its core, it's a play about language. It's a play about rhetoric and the power of the spoken word, and it's language that persuades characters to act. So given your background, in terms of language and communication and speech, what do you think is remarkable about this play and its use of language?
Oh, what a big question. And please chime in.
And chime in as well if people want to add in.
The speeches are huge. Like the way that the rhetoric is used, I think, like what comes to mind is Brutus's speech. I think it's just before Mark Antony's speech, but the call to arms and the way that that sense of the hive mind, the citizens, the way that they are addressed is just incredibly powerful. And I think, you don't see that a lot in a lot of other Shakespeare's plays. In terms of Mark Antony's speech, like the way that flows as well, there's a sense of that grief that's happening in relation to Mark Antony losing one of his really dear friends, and then the way that the journey of the language and the journey of Mark Antony as a character coming to terms with what needs to be done is just incredibly powerful. In terms of the conventions, I don't know if I'd be the best person to kind of chat to about the specifics of that, but if I think about my perspective as someone, as a speech pathologist, but also trained in terms of acting, we all communicate, and we don't communicate things for a particular purpose. So the level of it's incredibly dense in terms of language, but the way that the information is constructed in those really big speeches is, just incredibly huge.
And on the speeches, and I guess this is a question for our whole panel, do you think Shakespeare would have been employed to write the speeches of our modern day politicians? Should he have been given the chance?
Absolutely.
Yeah, he'd have been good at. Well, the first thing
Hope
he'd
say
be
no. He's above that, surely.
Yes, he's naturally inclined to earn money. But the thing is, he was trained in it, so he'd have learned this stuff at school. But I think what Marianne says is important, and the difference between those two speeches is important. So the Brutus speech is very rational and clear. The Antony speech plays on people's emotions, even has props, but only has props when he knows he's got the audience on his side. He waits, he plays with them, he teases them, he says what he doesn't really mean, and slowly they have to guess that he doesn't really mean it, and when they guess it, they come along with it. Whereas Brutus gives a speech like a kind of rational politician, like, believe me, these are my words, I believe them, this is rational, we killed him for these reasons, I'm sure you'll agree it was a good idea, fine. Exit stage. Antony doesn't do that. And it is two different approaches to rhetoric. And I think we do see them now. And the contrasts that the ones that we always use are in American politics, because Australian politicians don't make good speeches or think about making speeches, really, because it doesn't go down very well in Australia. But in America, there's a tradition of making big speeches. And the difference here is between Obama as a kind of Brutus character for me, who speaks in very rational ways in the traditions of classical rhetoric. Also a bit traditions of like the preacher as well, compared to Trump, who only has emotion. He only has emotion. And that's a little like Antony, I think. The only thing that Trump does in his speeches is say, I love you, please vote for me. And that's exactly what Antony does. He slowly gets them to love him, to love Caesar, and then goes, okay, I've persuaded you, go kill those people for me. And they do. It's extraordinary.
And there's some extraordinarily sneaky stuff in that Mark Antony speech. It's so wonderful. One of my favourite lines in there is he says, I am no orator, as Brutus is. Yeah, and it's like, well, hang on a sec, mate. You're a bloody good orator. He says, I only speak right on. I tell you that which you yourselves do know. So he's really trying to show that he's humble and one of the people. By contrast, Brutus, one of my favourite lines from that speech is, if any here would not be a Roman, speak, for him have I offended. So he's saying that if you don't agree with me, you're un-Roman, which again is a very contemporary political idea, that you define what it is to be a Roman, or you define what it is to be an Australian. Anything outside of that is un-Australian, is un-Roman. And so Brutus gets them on board very quickly with that, but he doesn't realise that in fact it's the emotion that is going to be the killer knockout blow. Which is exactly what Antony realises. And Antony's careful. He doesn't come straight in and start with the sob story of Caesar. He says, absolutely, you're right. Caesar was a tyrant, and I'm just here to speak about him, and I was his friend. But, you've heard from the Honourable Brutus, and he told you that Caesar was ambitious, and it was a grievous fault, and so on. And then just gradually winds them back towards him until by the end they're just baying for Brutus and Cassius's blood. And Brutus is such an arrogant character. He makes some big mistakes in this. Every time Cassius tells him, mate, okay, we'll kill Caesar, but we better kill Antony too. Brutus, says, no, that would be the wrong thing to do. Antony won't do anything. And then when Antony comes in and shakes the hand, Cassius says, mate, don't let him speak at the funeral. Again, Brutus says, no, we must. And then the final mistake during the battle is when Cassius tries to convince him not to march on Philippi, and Brutus says, no, we must. And so Brutus thinks that he's this great strategist and politician, whereas in fact it's Cassius who's got all the strategy but is constantly playing second fiddle to Brutus, and so ultimately they lose.
Are those two speeches as significant in the original Plutarch as they are in Shakespeare's, do you know?
No. So the events are described in Plutarch, but not spun out into speeches. So there Shakespeare's drawing on his schooling. So at grammar school, he'd have learnt Latin, and one of the things he'd have learnt as he was learning Latin was how Aristotelian rhetoric worked. And it works in famously three ways: ethos, logos, and pathos. So believability, logic, and emotion. And it's clear where the division comes in those two speeches. They both have a form of ethos. People are prepared to believe them. But Brutus is all logos, all logic, and I'm afraid pathos, emotion, wins the day.
One of the things I love too is that, there's so many times when you watch a Shakespeare play and people just go into speeches, but not in the context of giving a speech, like just a soliloquy. And these are actual speeches. And it kind of it sort of breaks a rule of drama. Or if you were teaching sort of screenwriting today, I was like, you'd never do two speeches in a row. You'd have the one big West Wing moment with the president. You'd never do two of them. He does back to back. Yeah. And it's sort of, and those two scenes, I think that it's scene 1 and scene 2 of Act 3. You get the assassination. We're still not even halfway into the play. And you have the climax, the dramatic climax of the play in scene 1 of Act 3. You then have the two great speeches of the play in the next scene. If I have a heretical sort of feeling about Julius Caesar, is that it never really gets any better than that, and that there's the great risk for anyone putting on the play is that the last two acts can be a bit of a come down after this amazing moment, double moment in Act 3.
That's right, and I know a lot of students are confused by why the play is called Julius Caesar and he dies. So
he's barely in it.
He's barely in it.
Someone said he's only in, I don't know, it's 4 scenes or something. It's a very small amount of scenes. He dies even before the halfway mark.
Yeah. So who's, okay, this is a question for the panel. Whose play is it then? It's called Julius Caesar, but whose play is it, Chris? Who do you think?
This is where I guess I have to put my cards on the table. So I love, maybe this is the answer to your first question to me about why I wrote about it. I studied ancient history and I love all of that ancient Rome stuff and really find Julius Caesar a compelling historical figure. So I find the play a little bit disappointing because it really isn't the story of Julius Caesar at all. Like, it doesn't cover his rise, it doesn't cover the amazing conquests and what a great general he was, all his torments about crossing the Rubicon and all of that. Shakespeare's done something which possibly is very brave, or possibly he's just aping whatever Plutarch did, but he comes into the Julius Caesar story at the very end of it. Now, if you did that for Richard III or King Henry IV, everyone would find it really puzzling. You're going, well, you've missed the gold. You've missed all the main bit. And so the Caesar lover in me and the historian in me isn't particularly nourished by Julius Caesar. To answer your question, you just need to put that aside and accept it's actually not about Julius Caesar. He doesn't have that many lines. He's not very well written. I don't know if others agree with. I don't think Caesar gets many good speeches or lines at all. I think he's sort of functional in a way. He's the functional tyrant against which two people need to decide whether to tolerate him or do away with him. The play is about Brutus, I think. I think it's about Brutus's genuine personal tension about knowing murder is wrong and that friendship is right, and yet still having such loyalty and duty to Rome first, ahead of any one person. And it's that inner struggle, I think, that a good production of Caesar taps into. But I've seen productions that emphasise Caesar as the character, as the principal character, and I don't think it works. I think you kind of need to keep Caesar as an almost secondary character and just own that it's a play about Cassius and Brutus.
Okay, so
but I'd like to hear what the experts feel like.
Chris is saying Brutus is the main character. Marianne?
I would say I feel like it's Brutus as well. Like I feel like that inner struggle and turmoil and that journey that he goes through that's why we love Shakespeare as well, right? Like we love the way that Shakespeare represents the human condition and the struggles, and that's why it's, sprawled 400 years later, and Brutus is representative of that. I would, Mark Antony as well, but I think Brutus is really representative of that inner struggle and turmoil. So I agree with you, Chris. I would say Brutus as well. Yeah.
You might be biased because you played his wife, didn't you, in the production? But no. Okay, James, who are you saying main character?
Yeah, sorry, it's got to be Brutus. And look, the reason for me is the razzle-dazzle of this play is the big speeches and the action sequence of the murder of Caesar. But the heart of the play for me is Brutus's soliloquy, "It must be by his death." This is an extraordinary soliloquy for so many reasons. I wish we could project it up here, go line by line. It's unbelievable. Not least because unlike almost any other soliloquy, it starts with the conclusion. So "it must be by his death" is the first line of the soliloquy, as in, I've got to kill him. Now we backfill the justification. And then he goes through all this whole argument about why Caesar may become a tyrant. He launches the idea of a preemptive strike. He may become a tyrant, therefore we should kill him. And at the end, he does this extraordinary rhetorical thing where he talks himself into it. He says, "Think him as a tyrant's egg, as a serpent's egg, and fashion him thus." So he keeps telling himself, you got to mold the image of Caesar into something that you don't truly believe in yourself in order to have a free society. So even at the moment when he plunges the dagger, I think Brutus is conflicted, and I think that then goes to that incredible scene in the tent on the battlefield, Act 4, Scene 3, between Brutus and Cassius, where they argue over why did we even do this? What was the point? If we're going to have corruption and payoffs, then why did we even bother killing Caesar? And it's such a beautiful contemporary scene between those two friends. And so that Brutus is tortured all the way through the play, I think. And I think that's really the heart of this play.
Is that speech the opposite of Macbeth, if it were done?
If it were done, well, Macbeth starts with a question like, should I do it or should I not?
Also, the moral dilemma has to convince himself, and then he decides.
Yeah, he gets to the end. Yeah, that's right. But yeah, Brutus has already decided, and then he's got to fill it in.
Okay, Hugh, what are your thoughts?
Well, I'll add some numbers. So Brutus speaks for 28% of the lines of the play. So that's a lot for a play. So that would be one reason. But I wouldn't change the title, to be honest. I love the play for all the reasons people have said, that we focus on Brutus with kind of alarming precision all the way through. He's really under the spotlight all the way through. And it's sometimes difficult to watch if you have a good performance, I think. He's kind of squirming at the end with the decisions that he's made or made wrongly. But it's something about Julius Caesar that is inescapable. He is an empty cipher. He's bad lines, not really drawn very clearly at the start of the play, other than a few gestures, accepting the crown, not accepting the crown, and so on. Is he superstitious or not? Very kind of skimpy kind of drawing of him. But that idea that he represents of a kind of inescapable power that we can't escape from under, however much we try. And I still want it to be called Julius Caesar, even if it might not be a very accurate portrayal of the whole life of Caesar. It's the idea that Shakespeare plants of this potentially dictatorial power that we can't escape, however much we try, that lingers to the end. Yeah.
Okay, we're already making allusions between contemporary politics and settings, and of course Julius Caesar is a play that lends itself to be transported to particular places and times and reflecting real historical events. I'm just remembering right now that when I was a young theatre maker, I was involved in an independent theatre production of Julius Caesar that was set in Jonestown with Kool-Aid and all. So some theatre companies, it was very dramatic, a chopper came in and some theatre companies choose to depict the character of Julius Caesar as a real-world figure. And I'm sure a lot of people in this room will know of a very controversial, fairly recent production that the Public Theatre did in 2017, in which Caesar was portrayed as Donald Trump. And this decision was met with great outrage and resulted in protesters interrupting performances and significant cancelled sponsorships, losing a lot of money. James, you recall that production. Yeah. Do you remember the fallout and the conversations around that?
Yeah, not just protests, but death threats. And not just death threats to the company, death threats to, like, indiscriminate death threats to anyone in theatre in the United States during that time, which is kind of, you kind of miss the point, because the protest was, stop showing violence against right-wing figures, I'm going to kill you, I was like, well, okay. Look, I take Chris's point on this. I really like what you said about not over-egging it, not overdoing the political... Because if you do that, if I dress Caesar in a red tie and a blonde wig and have him, talk like Trump, then that's the only thing the play means. Then that's it. And to me, that's a bit reductive, because we want, it's what I call pre-masticated theatre. So I've already chewed it up and digested it for you, and you just need to now have my interpretation. Whereas I like to think of theatre as that the audience needs to bring a little bit of themselves and do some of the work. And what I love about Shakespeare is its ambiguity, and the fact that two people can be sitting next to each other and have a completely different experience of the play because of what they bring to the performance. So I shy away from those kinds of interpretations and like to leave it a lot more up to the audience and let the text and Shakespeare's words actually do the work.
And I've got a statement from the Public Theatre here. They said, our production of Julius Caesar in no way advocates violence towards anyone. Shakespeare's play and our production make the opposite point. Those who attempt to defend democracy by undemocratic means pay a terrible price and destroy the very thing they are fighting to save. We stand completely behind our production. And that the heated discussion and debate is exactly the goal of our civically engaged theatre. This discourse is the basis of a healthy democracy.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right, because they miss the point completely, these protesters, because they're protesting against the violence towards Caesar. Whereas, in fact, what Shakespeare's saying is not, let's bump off Trump. He's saying, if you bump off Trump, something much worse is going to come along. And of course it did. In ancient Rome, they didn't get democracy for many more years. Augustus Caesar took over, and then that was it. It was an emperor. So, I think that's the point of the play.
It's pretty dumb, though. I think it sort of treats the audience as a bit foolish, because the beauty of it is that the audience is smart enough to understand the allusions without putting the red tie and the blonde wig on, which is what you were saying. And it's such a... The beauty of Julius Caesar, and I think the reason people do use it or refer to it in, a lot of political journalists will always refer to it. I don't know if anyone's been watching Nemesis, the show about the coalition over the last 10, 11 years. You can't watch that documentary and have lived through that history without thinking about Caesar, because it's such a perfect literalization of backstabbing and all of that. But because I think the public is so well informed and versed in both theatre and politics, you just know that that interpretation comes built in. The minute you literalise it, I think you're dumbing it down, is my view. And apart from anything else, the minute you've said Caesar is Trump, none of the other stuff around it makes any sense. Like Calpurnia's dreams and stuff. Melania didn't do that. So you've dug a hole for yourself, because the rest of the play, Shakespeare didn't write it with Trump in mind, so nothing makes sense. The analogy only goes so far. They're both a bit power hungry, and that's too thin, I reckon.
Yeah, absolutely. And James, you mentioned this in terms of your preference when you're directing or approaching theatre, because I want to talk about your production of Julius Caesar in 2018. Were you inspired by real events and settings, even if you didn't deliberately choose something? And how did you approach the setting of that production?
No, I think that production it kind of had a dystopian feel, you know. It was kind of like some post-apocalyptic world where already everything was all broken down, and Caesar was this figure that had risen up through the ashes of that. So it wasn't the typical kind of boardroom, everyone in suits and ties. Everyone was kind of, it was really kind of after a war. Everyone was pretty dishevelled. So again, yeah, I just tried to leave it quite open. I tried not to put specific interpretations. Marianne, you were part of it. What do you reckon?
Do you remember what it was like to tour that production and the impact of that story, taking it around Australia?
Yeah, I do. So absolutely the interpretation and the world of it was that post-apocalyptic vibe. So, you know, people were able to kind of not see a particular person there, but it was representative of someone, you know, coming to power. But what was really fascinating about touring that production at that time was what was happening in Australian politics in 2018. And I don't know if any of you remember when Malcolm Turnbull was overthrown and who was it? Scott Morrison.
Jomo.
Yes. So that happened.
Not that he thinks he knows anything about it.
Absolutely.
Yeah, he had no intentions.
That's right. But I have this memory of we're actually in Mildura. So what's that? Regional Victoria. And we're all in our hotel rooms, and then suddenly the WhatsApp group starts pinging because we're all coming to know that what we're touring, you know, someone being overthrown in power is actually happening in Australian politics. It's not the first time that
To be fair, that was every 2 months.
This is very true. I was just about to say it's not the first time it's happened, right? But that was actually quite exciting in a weird kind of way because it galvanised us to, you know, perform the show that we were performing with that extra energy behind us, knowing that, you know, these words and this story is still absolutely relevant, you know, in today's society and world.
And you do Q&As and engagements with the audience all the way through. Do you remember having any conversations or anything that was happening around that with audience members?
Nothing that's sticking to mind, but there was definitely, you know, I think there was probably a Q&A that was happening around that time where everyone was like, oh, you know, this is exciting, what's happening, what do you guys think? Which is always great because, you know, it's again, it's that hive mind and it's the people who are the citizens that are being affected. So that was a lot of fun. That was a great time.
So what I do think the play gets really right, and that is still so bang on and relevant to any political power tussle today, it's not obviously everyone's always irresistibly drawn to the backstabbing and the conniving, but it's not that. It's the backroom persuasion that's going on, and you get this between Brutus and Cassius. Cassius is trying to persuade Brutus to do the unthinkable and remove a leader. And, you know, we were talking about the post-death speeches earlier, but the pre-death persuasive arguments and what we'd call today backroom dealing, doing the numbers, I reckon that years before the Westminster system, he got that really, really right. I reckon the way those conversations are had, they're never really out in the open. They're all, oh, what do you think?
It's the money under the table type vibe.
So if we look at contemporary politics, and maybe if you were to do Dead Caesar today, I mean, I guess Cassius is like a backroom politician, faceless man. Would you say, who would he be in our world today, and who is the Brutus and the Antony and the Caesar if you're doing Dead Caesar? Panel? Audience?
It's probably not in Australia. Do you want us to do Australia? Do you know who? We haven't talked about Cassius. You know, we all, I think, agree that Brutus is probably the main character. I don't think Brutus is the most interesting character. I think it is probably his story. My slight difficulty with Brutus is he seems to sort of live by the traits of stoicism, and he's very stoic, and that's not very dramatic. Just someone who's, you know, being told to remove emotion and passion from everything and just be driven by duty and virtue. That's sort of how I read Brutus. Whereas Cassius, he with the lean and hungry look, Cassius, I think, does go on a slightly more interesting journey than Brutus, or at least an actor has the choice to make it slightly more interesting, because there'd be a bad version, where he's just, cartoonish villain, bad guy. But I think there's real goodness in Cassius, and there's real heartbreak about his relationship with Brutus and what becomes of them. What I was going to say about, I always see a lot of Paul Keating in Cassius. I always think if like he was because his relationship with Hawke. So if Hawke is Caesar in this analogy, because Cassius is very gifted. He's really brilliant. He knows he's probably going to make a better leader than the guy who's currently got the job. And I always thought that actually reflects the Keating-Hawke relationship. I'm not sure I've seen it reflected in Australian politics since, but you can spin these any way you want if you want. It's sort of a fun game, and I guess that's what theatre directors and comedians do.
Okay, so we've talked a lot about modern day political relevances. We're constantly, of course, seeing Julius Caesar reflected in all of these events in newspaper headlines and stories. We continue to see political backstabbing and events likened to the play. I know that a lot of politicians love the play, potentially because it is about politics, but also because of the language and the rhetoric. I guess again, another question for the panel. When you look at our current world, how does the use of language in politics play out? And is it the same strategies that we see in Julius Caesar? Has the language in politics evolved or maybe devolved?
One of the things that I love about the way politics plays out in this play, which I think is really innovative, and it does speak, I think, to ourselves as political agents. So nobody knows what the hell they're doing all the way through the play. Nobody knows why they're doing what they're doing. The scene in which Brutus comes to realise that he has to murder Caesar, it starts with him not being able to see. He's completely in the dark. He has to ask for lights, and it ends with him leading a character who says, "Well, I don't know where he's leading me to, but it's Brutus leading me, so I'll go." And it's like the blind, like through that scene where this momentous thing happens, the killing of a potential leader. Nobody has any idea why they're doing it or what the consequences of it will be. And that strikes me as a really interesting approach to politics, which is very innovative from Shakespeare. And even though I teach Shakespeare for a living, I don't often see him having innovative ideas. His language is innovative. But here I think is a really innovative idea, that politics is all about making a decision even though you don't know why, and you don't know what the result of it will be, but you kind of have to do it anyway. And I think that is
politics.
It is exactly, I think, how politics still plays out. Australian politics, perhaps, really markedly over the last 2 decades. But yeah.
But also, I mean, when I was talking earlier about the mob, I think that scene, it's a kind of an overlooked scene in the play where the mob tears apart a poet. Just because he's got the same name as one of the conspirators. Just an hour ago, I was down in Circular Quay and I bumped into Danny Lim. Do you know Danny Lim? The guy with the sign and everything. And,
yes.
And he's talking about bringing peace. And there's something about that guy. And I was talking to him for a little bit, and he starts talking about all the bad things that happened to him. I always assume, I know that there was that story, that awful story where he got put in the hospital by some thug police officers. But he said that he gets abused all the time, like constantly. I thought people would just give him a thumbs up and move on. But he said people are constantly, especially in packs, in groups, coming up and hassling him and giving him grief. And there's something about people being in a pack that gives them that safety to be able to attack someone weaker, to be able to attack someone who perhaps is a little bit outside of their own experience, and especially, as Shakespeare shows, an artist, someone who is a poet who is creating art. They're often the first ones to get targeted and attacked, and I think we definitely see that today. I think Shakespeare got that exactly right.
Okay, let's move on to other productions and other explorations of this play. And one of the recent productions, which Hugh, I'd like to talk to you about, because I know you were a fan and you wrote about it, was Sydney Theatre Company's 2021 Julius Caesar. And for those of you that didn't see it, it had 3 actors performing. It was directed by Kit Williams, had a lot of use of video and film throughout. Hugh, what was interesting and significant about that one? Because it also leaned on contemporary politics a lot.
Yeah, it did a lot, didn't it? And it was, I guess, the beginning, really, of Kit Williams' experiments with not just video screens, because he uses, I think, video screen's been used on stage for decades now, but I think he started using them in quite a new way with that production that has obviously rolled out into the kind of huge thing of Dorian and so on. And it's just the simple thing of using the mobile phones as cameras that he did in that production, which I thought was, maybe it felt gimmicky, and I think people around me found it a bit gimmicky. I really loved it because of the rapid movement that it allowed. So people were able to run around stage, and it gave you the sense of chaos that I think we often don't get with the play when we read it, or that we see it in these kind of very monumental productions that we sometimes have that try for that kind of Roman gravitas. And it really instead was incredibly edgy. And I don't mean edgy in a kind of, trendy kind of way. I mean, literally edgy, like people are always on edge all the way through, particularly as it had a very small cast as well. So there was kind of constant running around, changing of scenes without you quite understanding what was happening. And it, for me at least, really played to that sense that I have of the play of once you get launched into it, you're in chaos, however much people try and rationalize what's happening to them. And they speak all the time. People are constantly talking in the play. There is very little implied stage direction. It is just people talking at each other or themselves all the time. It's relentless. But it's a form of chaos that doesn't really make sense of the action. And for me, it grabbed that sense of people trying to capture moments in the play with, their phone, but also it just escaping them all the time. That it was a kind of chaos. So yeah, I loved it. I'm a big fan of the way that Kit Williams directs those plays. But it was kind of interesting to see him start it there.
And my favourite moment in the production was actually Mark Antony's speech, who, if you saw it, they really spliced up that speech. It was performed by Geraldine Hakewell in a white power suit, got into heels and a white power suit, then launched into Mark Antony's speech, and it was just, as she went along, interspersed with lines that we all know from politicians and history, incredibly powerful. And at the very end of that show, and I will say, I was watching the show and seated next to me was Gladys Berejiklian. We were all in masks, but we knew that it was her. And at the end of that production, on the screens, do you remember, Hugh, they did a montage of starting back with the Romans of all, politicians, and it went bang, 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 bang all the way through. And I got closer and went through George Bush, and we went all the way up, and we were getting into Australian politics, and I was starting to feel very uncomfortable. With Gladys next to me. We had ScoMo, we had everyone there. Anyway, I don't think they show Gladys. But I can share that she did gasp very loudly in the assassination scene. So that was an interesting night at the theatre. Okay, now, we've spoken a lot about men here because, of course, there's no denying this is a male-dominated play. In fact, there are around 35 male roles and 2 female roles, one of which is Calpurnia, who is the wife of Caesar, and Portia, who is the wife of Brutus. And they speak in only 2 scenes each. They also, I believe, Hugh, not spoken much at all about in the source material, so perhaps Shakespeare gave them more than the pages of history did. Marianne, you played Portia, Brutus's wife, in the 2018 Bell Shakespeare production. What was it like to play this role in such a male-dominated play? And what do you think about the way that Shakespeare wrote these women?
I loved playing Portia. I love the monologue that was in our production, and I think it was actually only one scene that we included. The production that we had, Mark Antony was actually played by a woman, so that was really great in terms of seeing that interpretation of the text and that relationship. Portia's relationship to Brutus is, in that particular speech, to me, it's all about reason. She's presenting it with so much information about, hey, mate, this is essentially what I'm saying, and this is what I'm getting as your partner and as your wife. What's going on? And she's asking all these rhetorical questions in response to how he's acting, the lack of information that he's giving her, and she ultimately ends it with saying, if you're not going to disclose this to me, I'm no more than a harlot. I'm no more than, a prostitute, essentially. I really loved that relationship because she does not have a lot of text or stage time or airtime, but the potency in which she delivers her reasoning as a wife and as that female character in the play is really key, because I think it also encapsulates the level of frustration and turmoil that he has within himself outside of all of the male dominated ambition that's going on. And I think, Shakespeare's choice to choice to include a lack of there of female roles speaks to the lack of females at that time and their position in society, of course. So yeah, I had a really great time. Before it was essentially one scene, but I love that monologue. It's potent. It's so potent.
I always struggle a bit with Portia's death. I don't know if that scene was included in your production, but how did you justify her actions when it come to her suicide, effectively?
Yeah, so we, it's kind of it's spoken about, and then the information is delivered to Brutus. The way that I interpreted it was that was her attempt at catharsis in a way. She wasn't being heard in a way, both. Yeah, but I didn't really see it as a protest or a way to seek attention, for want of a better term, but it was the struggle that she was having was, I'm trying to support you and I'm going through all of this other stuff that, in her own mental state, as a result of other reasons. That was her attempt at, I have to kind of go away from this pain of watching you go through this experience and the level of turmoil that's in myself and trying to silence that.
Yeah, and silence is the key word, isn't it? I mean, the women have so little to say in this play, and the manner in which she takes her life. Of course, she, as Brutus hears that she swallowed hot coals. I think it's important that Shakespeare's done that. That obviously it's from the source material, I assume, but still it's symbolic of her not having a voice, I think.
And it's true of both female characters in the play, Calpurnia, Caesar's wife. They both have intelligence and intellect and great foresight and insight and speak that, but are not listened to, and they kind of serve as these empty warnings that are not listened to. So silence, as you say, is the key word. Yeah.
Yeah, and both Calpurnia and Portia, in the sense that they have these attempts to be that voice of reason, and it's just not heard.
Now Caesar himself is so stubborn. He's given so many warnings not to go to the forum that day. The soothsayers had a couple of cracks at him. His wife's had a dream.
Guides of March.
And it's... I feel a bit uncomfortable, in contemporary life with superstition and that kind of thing, but it's a very big part of this play. we haven't really touched on it, but superstition and dreams are a huge part. They are of a lot of Shakespeare plays, but in this play, they play a central role in this play. And it's sort of interesting that Caesar's painted as having the hubris to not believe in superstition. Today, he'd be regarded as the only sane man in the room, but back then, it was sort of seen as a weakness to not listen to soothsayers.
Yeah, maybe Hugh, do you have anything to share on superstition?
Yeah, well, partly about Caesar's reaction, perhaps. So I always see it as Caesar kind of forcing himself to go, even though he doesn't want to. And there is a kind of thing about masculinity all the way through the play, isn't there? And the idea that Caesar might be too womanish because he has this fainting sickness, or because he's not a very good swimmer at one point, or he might listen to soothsayers, or he might listen to his wife, and he has to overcome all of these things, and instead embody a kind of, Roman masculinity, which he seems ill-suited to be fair, but which Brutus is absolutely suited for. Doesn't do him any good either.
Yeah, I think, Caesar kind of has to put on this kind of Putin-esque vibe, whereas in fact, I don't think he's... I think when Calpurnius says, I had a dream, stay at home, he's actually quite relieved. He's like, all right, honey, I will. But in fact, he's like, good, yeah, thank God, I'll just blame it on you, it's all right. But then in comes Decius and kind of tweaks his manhood and says, well, now look, the Senate might think you're afraid if you don't show up. And in fact, Calpurnia's dream was great because your statue spouting blood actually is a good thing. And Caesar says, oh, okay, well, I'd better go then. But yes, this whole idea of masculinity runs through the play. Even Cassius says Caesar was like a sick girl when he was ill and called for drink, so they're constantly having to try and overcome that.
And it works the other way as well, because Portia, in order to gain attention and to be able to speak, wounds herself and makes herself bleed, which in Roman political society is the thing that allows you to speak. Later in Shakespeare's play Coriolanus, there's a whole kind of thing throughout the play about showing your wounds to the public, and that being something that gives you a voice, that shows you are virtuous, and a kind of masculine virtue. And Portia has to take that on in order to be heard. She kind of cuts her thigh so it bleeds, and then this somehow gives her a voice. So yeah, this play with gender roles all the way through, really. So even though it clearly doesn't have many women speaking at all, it's actually focused on questions of masculinity, really, all the way through, and the fragility of that.
And so it's interesting that we mention this because, and maybe James, you can speak to this, in a lot of contemporary productions, of course, part of it is just balancing the gender and giving opportunities to female identifying actors, is that a lot of times roles are given to female actors. In your production, you had a female Mark Antony. It's interesting that in the previous Bell Shakespeare Julius Caesar, which was directed by Peter Evans, Cassius was played by Kate Mulvaney, and that's really interesting, isn't it? Because Cassius has some choice things to say about weakness, and Cassius has the swimming speech, isn't it? Yeah. James, when you cast, it was Sarah Zwangabani as Mark Antony, and approaching that, was Sarah, obviously we now have a lot of women in politics compared to when Shakespeare was writing in Roman history. Was it a deliberate choice or a comment, or was it just an actor playing a role, or was it a specific female role?
No, I think it was deliberate, and I think I don't think we can ever say it's just an actor playing a role, because bodies in space make meaning. Okay, so when you see someone on stage, you automatically ascribe. There's no such thing as a neutral body or neutral actor or a neutral face or anything. I think everyone is there. The audience will ascribe a meaning to them, and I thought it would be strange to have a political play with no female players in those higher echelons. And our Octavius was played by M. Havea as well, Emily Havea. So I think it's interesting, and and often when some of the male roles are cast with female identifying actors, they're often the more virtuous roles. I wanted to make clear that the two kind of dictators at the end of the play could also be women. And Jane Caro came up to me after opening night. She said, "Oh, it's great to see two female fascists up there at the end of the play." Because they can be involved in politics, and I just wanted to make sure that was open to everyone.
Yeah, great. Okay, I've got a final question for our panel tonight before we will open up to our audience for questions. So start thinking about what you'd like to ask our panel. Okay, obviously this play is full of famous lines and speeches, very, very famous classics. So I'd like to ask our panel what your favourites are, or if you have an underrated line or speech. I'll let you think about that for a moment, while I think it is absolutely worth mentioning here that, of course, when Nelson Mandela was a political prisoner on Robben Island, he and his fellow inmates had a complete works of Shakespeare and highlighted their favourite passages, and it was known as the Robben Island Bible. And in 1977, Mandela marked the following lines from Act 2 of Julius Caesar, which starts with, "Cowards die many times before their deaths. The valiant never taste of death but once." So a personal favourite of Nelson Mandela. What about our panel? Is it Friends, Romans, Countrymen, or is there a part of it, Hugh, you're dying to say something?
Partly because I want to rescue school teachers from the earth. So I went to school in North Wales and had an English teacher who was wonderful, but he used to smoke a pipe all the way through class, was very slow and lugubrious, but also had this kind of Welsh gravitas, like straight from the chapel. And until you've had Brian Price look you in the eye and say, "There is a tide in the affairs of men," then you've never heard that speech. So my favourite will always be, "There is a tide in the affairs of men, which taken at the flood."
Anyone else? James, do you have a particular favourite?
Look, I'm always, God, we could go for hours on this, but I'm always fascinated by the first line of plays. I've kind of got a collection of them. I know most of the first lines of all the Shakespeare plays. I'm interested in them rhythmically, about how they grab the audience's attention, how they get you in, how Shakespeare hooks you. 3 of his plays start with the word now, and a lot of the plays start with the iambic rhythm is da-dum, 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 da-dum. Often the play starts with a strong beat instead of the regular ba-bum. And so this play is one of them. And the first line in this play is, "Hence, home, you idle creatures, get you home." And it's one of the tribunes coming in to talk to the mob and get them to disperse and stop celebrating Caesar. And I just love that Shakespeare has an ear for the first lines and how to grab you with that strong first syllable. So I love that.
And it catches you off balance a little bit, doesn't it? Straight in. Marianne?
Oh, there's so many, but I'm going to choose a more comedic one. Casca's speech. It was Greek to me. It's so short and pithy, but I really like it because, sometimes when I don't understand stuff, I'm like, yeah, it was Greek to me.
And one of those lines that's just entered our lexicon, entered our regular conversation. Chris?
My memory's terrible, so I'm going to read it. I'm not as erudite as these guys. And there's people that just commit Shakespeare to memory. I'm not one of those people. But I absolutely love... this is my favourite. We sort of, in my family, we do a lot of et tu brutes, and we throw those around. But the loveliest piece of writing, I think, is this passage that Brutus is speaking to Cassius. He says, "There is a tide in the affairs of men, which taken at the flood leads on to fortune. Omitted, all the voyage of their life is bound in shallows and in miseries." I just think that's such a perfect summation of the duality of our lives. And it's, I think about that a lot.
Incredible. Okay, let's open...
That was also my audition for the next Bill Shakespeare.
There you go, thank you. Why not get it in there? Okay, audience, if you would like to ask a question, we will need you to have the microphone, so please put your hand up and Lydia will come round to you.
This man's had his hand up since the very first minute of the session.
That's because Hugh gave a bit of backgrounding to Shakespeare's 1599 play. The Bishop's Ban of 1599 was one of the two major acts of censorship around that time. And it was specifically aimed at satire, not history. Satire more to do with contemporary politics. It really anathematised the works of Thomas Nash, who was more of a satirist than a playwright. 2 years before was the second biggest act of censorship, which was the Isle of Dogs, where they closed down all the theatres and said, you've got to destroy all those theatres. And they turned a blind eye when they didn't. But Thomas Nash got caught up in that as well. That was satire as well. Ben Jonson got caught up in the Isle of Dogs fiasco as well. The Isle of Dogs has never been found again because they burnt it. And in the Bishop's Ban of 1599, they burnt all of Thomas Nash's works, of all that they could get hold of. That was all satire. He never wrote anything again.
No, that's right. Yeah, so there was two strands to that. One is, and you're right, it was mainly satire because of the kind of ongoing political kind of nightmares that I think that Elizabeth was experiencing towards the end of the 1590s, and also a fear about literary production in London getting out of hand, escaping censorship. But it's also true that that certain forms of English history were banned from being put into print, although not from the stage, not from the stage.
Thank you. Any other questions? Yes, down the front here, Lydia.
Right. Look, thank you for performing such a good review of the play. Now, being a multicultural Australian, when I was in my school doing HSC type of course, I was introduced to, I had to study Shakespeare, and Macbeth was the thing which I had to read and study. Now, I found it very difficult to understand Shakespeare and the language and the ideas, and a huge amount of teaching and education is there to reform the whole society. And my teacher was telling me that Globe and the theatre were used to be full of people there, common people. They were throwing things. And I don't understand, how did they understand all that? I couldn't understand it. Now, could anyone tell me, how could they comprehend that language?
The usual answer to that is it was a more oral culture than one we have now, and one in which people were used to hearing each other speak in public in ways that we're not anymore. We're a much more visual culture, aren't we? We go watch films, we watch the television. We don't go hear preachers so often. Whereas this is a culture in which people were obliged to go to church every week, where they'd have been spoken at in quite elaborate terms, where there were people speaking on street corners, and where there were spoken entertainments with very little scenery. So yeah, it does seem very complicated. And I think that actually Shakespeare writes in a way that is way more complicated than many of his contemporary playwrights. And sometimes some of that, I think, will escape audiences, both then and now. But as a rule, audiences then were much more attuned to hearing people speak in public.
Yeah, I do think it's more complicated. I'm in the middle of editing King Lear for our next production, and we're doing some edits on the play. And boy, that is a knotty play. I mean, talk about your dense and knotty dialogue. Wow. But partly, and what I say to young people and students who complain about Shakespeare as well, is that that's the reward of it too. If it was so simple, then you wouldn't have that wonderful sense of achievement and joy and reward of finding. And still, maybe I've read Midsummer Night's Dream, I don't know how many times, and I read it again the other day because I was trying to find a quote for the marketing department. So they always want, can you come up with a Shakespeare quote that's like about trust and friendship and stuff like that? Okay. And so I read Midsummer Night's Dream again, and I just read new things that I'd never read before as well. So I find that Shakespeare's constantly rewarding me, and that's what I love about it. The complexity of it is actually what I love. Yeah.
I will also say, in terms of the text, like whenever I encounter a Shakespeare play or a monologue, I don't understand all the words, even if I've encountered it before. And I have a dictionary specifically with Shakespearean language that helps me understand it. And I think that's pretty consistent in every Shakespeare rehearsal room. So we're always learning, because it's a bit of a treasure trove as well, and it's rewarding in that respect.
And also, obviously, we work with young people every day in Shakespeare, and it's also sometimes as simple as a conversation about language changes and evolves over time. And I say to young people, the things I have to ask them to translate what they're saying. What does this word mean? And I say to them, if someone in 400 years' time heard you speak, they also wouldn't understand all the words that you're saying. And that's just language. It just evolves all the time. So, yeah, thank you for your question. Other questions? Any hands up? Final questions for our audience? We have a few more minutes.
Yes.
Thank you, Lydia.
We've, excuse me, we've seen empires and kingdoms and revolutions come and go. We've seen the toppling of political systems like democracy, fascism, socialism, communism topple. How close are we to attaining our political utopia or our heaven on earth?
Nice, easy one to
Can
end
we
with.
answer that one? Over to you, Chris.
When's that happening?
Fuck off. I don't know. That hurts my brain, that question. I was struggling to discuss a play. I can't answer that. No, if anyone else wants to take that one.
How would Shakespeare? Utopia, yeah. I don't know. I think you're asking a bunch of theatre nerds to solve the world's problems.
I don't know if we ever
What do you
will
think?
reach
What do you think?
I don't know if we ever will reach a political utopia.
No.
I mean, there's definitely
Well,
points where
It's subjective. Someone's
this is very
utopia,
true,
wouldn't
this is
it?
Very true. That's right.
Well, I guess, yeah, the serious answer is, and apologies for swearing, I was just joking, but and the play, to bring it back to the play, it speaks to this, is that everyone is always trying to improve society. By killing Caesar, they thought they were going to improve Rome. Everyone thinks they have the answer to utopia, but what the play is really about is that it's messier than that, and utopia is almost impossible. I think it is impossible, and that not just makes good drama, but it probably makes for a more interesting society. Wouldn't it be boring if there was nothing to bitch about and about Canberra? So I'd be out of work. So yeah, I actually think that's never going to happen. Is that disappointing or liberating for you to hear?
That Shakespeare was inspired by and also revered, and I'm not a Bible basher. there's like the Bible talks about a kingdom, like Christ's kingdom, to come. Not everyone's going to believe that. That would be an ideal, but sometimes you have to have the ideal so that you always aspire towards perfection. And who knows, it might come true.
Thank you. Okay, Lydia, do we have time for one more up the back? Yes?
I have a theatre nerd question. I love to chat about Brutus and how he's very void of emotion. I'd love to talk hear a little bit more from you about Antony and just how highly emotional he is, because my favourite line is "Cry havoc and let slip the dogs of war," because I can still see the spit that in the lights from when Ben Mendelsohn said that 20 years ago at STC. So emotion, can you just give me a little bit of high emotion for these last 4 minutes?
Okay, Antony and emotion. Who wants to take it?
Well, my favourite production of this isn't a stage production at all, but is the old film. Yes, of course, which I think, in a bit of cross-promotion, Bell Shakespeare is putting on in their film season. But has Marlon Brando as Anthony, and boy, does he deliver that speech as Marlon Brando. And it's Marlon Brando at the height of Brando-ness. So it's in between Streetcar and On the Waterfront. He does this right in between there. So he's beautiful, huge, and looks fantastic in a toga. And he just delivers that speech with a really interesting style, really, because it's very obvious that he's an American actor attempting really hard to put something together for a very kind of classical. So John Gielgud is in this. It's very kind of Englishy, trying to do the play, and yet here he is, this method actor, completely out of place. There's actually really sweet interviews with John Gielgud talking about Brando asking him to help him become more like a Shakespearean actor, and Gielgud not doing it, and so on. But all of that restrained emotion comes over in that, and I think it's just wonderful performance. If you haven't seen that film, please do.
I haven't, so I'm
Yes.
going to look that up
I
tonight.
will say Bell Shakespeare is doing a Shakespeare on Film series this year. I can't remember the date, but later this year that film will be shown down at Pier 23. So look up the website.
Big screen.
Thank you very much. Is that all we have? Yeah, that's all we have time for. Thank you so much. Can we thank our panel? Hugh Griffiths, James Evans, Marianne, Chris Taylor. Thank you so much. Have a lovely evening.